The collect for St. Camillus is in itself quite dense, remembering how this young man, who had been a man of his time, not in his youth living a very edifying life, had been touched profoundly by divine grace to the extent that he himself, unwell, realized how important it was to care for those who were unwell, and seeing that how he was able to do so, felt the call to found a brotherhood that would do just that, even though himself he did go back to school to study and was ordained a priest. But this was the specificity of his vocation and his consecration. But in that context we have this prayer which says it all. So it starts off, O God, who adorned the priests and Camillus with a singular grace of charity towards the sick, pour out upon us by his merits a spirit of love for you. So we hear already the juxtaposition of the two dynamics, so that, serving you, here again, you, in our neighbour. That's the vision of Christ himself in the one cared for. We may, at the hour of our death, pass safely over to you. Now, he eventually in his brotherhood had responsibility for Santo Spirito in Rome, and we know that care of the sick in those days wasn't at all the same as what we understand by care of the sick, actually getting them better. It was in practice helping them to die without too much discomfort. But his congregation was able to work on that and bring in another notion. However, the fact that this is in the collect indicates how, from the beginning, this other part comes into it. It is the care of the whole person, so that, eventually, the bit that goes on, and lands safe and sound, because one cannot just take care of the outside and neglect what actually is going to go on, and that is what is happening quite often in much of our health care. It has to be efficient and professional, but one cannot really care for just the outside of the person. Today I was in a hospice where in fact there is no healing going on, just care of those who are in the last stages. And people, even young people, end up there and don't last very long. It just, with the person who took me there today, I was hearing a testimony of somebody who was about 40 and about 5 weeks ago had gone, but in the time he'd had there, something had actually happened which probably did adjust his eternity. So it is important, at least in that domain, that the other thing happen. And indeed, there was another case he mentioned that happened in the same place, or rather with his brother, who was a priest, because we were saying the Divine Mercy chaplet for the person that we went to see who was dying, for that person, and at the end of it, my friend said how his brother, who was a priest, had occasion to minister to a person who was dying, but he had to obtain the consent of the family so as to do certain things, and they were withholding that consent, so he couldn't insist, but he was, at this point, actually dying. It was a she, actually, it was a lady. And he, at that point, saw that maybe if they were all present and seeing what was going on, they would allow him to at least pray with the person. And they said, okay. And he did, and he just simply prayed the Divine Mercy chaplet holding the hand of the person. And actually, that person in that time was lucid and opened up in some mysterious way, because showed obviously that there was a reception of what was happening in her soul. And by the end of the Divine Mercy Chaplet, there had been sufficient indication that she was actually sort of switched on to God. And the actual moment of death was quite moving. He described what happened. So these are things that we need to be aware of in the presence of somebody who hasn't got a lot to live, because people are wasting those precious times by the bedside talking about all kinds of things which are not particularly helpful, forgetting that actually at that point there's a big battle going on. We can't see it, but there are demonic forces hovering around a person at that stage, wanting their pound of flesh, and they are not victorious because Michael is there also, but they can be if nothing is done. We forget that that point is actually of cosmic importance. We can't afford to just be light-hearted when all eternity is ahead. So this question of passing on safely over to you is important. I had in student days a friend who was in that ministry, that is, she was the daughter of the matron of a nursing home, and she herself was nursing and would have often nights, and she would have the ministry of preparing these for death, and she said, I hand them over to Jesus, I hand them over to God. Mine is the last face they see before they look into his. And things happen, and she would describe them at the moment of death. She also said how painful it was to see how these people that they had nursed with a lot of tender loving care were simply put in plastic bags, and it was very hurtful to their sensitivity because they were not just bits of flesh, but they had a story that they knew, persons that they had loved and cared for. Plastic bags. The first reading also talks about corpses. Here we have in the prophet Isaiah a very poetic passage which ends like this: Your dead will come to life, their corpses will rise, awake, exult, all you who lie in the dust, for your dew is a radiant dew, and the land of ghosts will give birth. The land of ghosts. One time I was in an aeroplane coming, I believe, from Italy either to Britain or to Ireland, and it was in the early stages of my getting to be aware of the whole field of computers. It was fairly new, and I was puzzled to see what this gentleman next to me was doing. He was actually watching a film on his laptop. I didn't know it was possible until then, and although I couldn't hear what was being said, now and again I was peeping in what was going on, and there was this kind of James Bond affair. It was an interesting scene when actually this person was shot in this kind of last chase or whatever it was, and the word that was said was, by him, I'm a ghost. So it was an interesting way, Hollywood style, to put into the mouth of that, by then nearly corpse, the vision of his new reality. And a ghost is precisely one who can't do anything. It has to reap the consequences and follows its weight. Once without the body, one can't do an awful lot. The will is then prisoner of what it's done. And we forget that. We only have power over time and over orientation of eternity as long as we have a living breath. 1 second after, it's done. And all that is what the demons are aware of when somebody is about to breathe his last. It's a big moment, because one moment can actually change all eternity at that point if the person is not prepared. And by the way, it concerns us all. Remember how Blessed Lady showed the children at Fatima where sinners went, and added, because no one was there to pray for them, and to make sacrifices for them, indicating, and they copped on, and they did so, that they had to be making sacrifices out of things they could invent and also offer up the pains that were part of life. That's our business, all of us. We're all in some kind of pain. We're all suffering invisibly, at least, of something. It's all matter which can help. Somebody right now, at this moment in time, is at that point of transition from fullness to ghost-like existence forever. They're big questions, and what happens? The devil knows they're big questions, so he makes sure that no one thinks about it. And all this huge amount of noise around us favours greatly the ploy of the demons. Make sure no one thinks about what matters. They have huge amount of time, men especially, to talk about things like the latest football match, hours on end, talk about tactics on the football field, but they're not quite so good at facing the big things of life. Women also waste many hours in fairly light conversation, and we only have a certain amount of time. Our clock is wound up and it will run out of time. So, with regard to preparing for death, people sometimes have this cop-out. They say to themselves, well, I'll get my act together at the last moment. If they're Catholics, they might have the instinct, well, I'll go to confession when it's close to the end. But it's a dicey business. There was a case in England some centuries ago of a lady during the beginnings of the changes in England who had been brought up there for a Catholic and was not at ease about what she was being told now in church, because the same churches physically were being now used for what was becoming a Protestant cult. And she had this instinct in her heart, this can't be right, and yet the experts say it is, so I must follow. So she thought, there's one priest maybe who is a great theologian, he can help me, I will go all the way and find him. And she went to Oxford or Cambridge, I forget what it was, one of the big universities, and found him in his college and asked if she could ask him a question. He listened with respect, but she prefaced her question with this: I will ask you, Reverend Father, because I know you have great knowledge, but I will ask you upon your soul, that was the bit, upon your soul, to tell me in which church I must live. That of Rome or that which the state is proposing right now. Now he could have brushed her off, but he didn't. He thought for a moment and said straight up, Madam, I could dismiss you, but because you asked me upon my soul, I will tell you. The church in which you must live, because of the inconveniences of the present state of affairs, is that of the king. But the church in which you must die is that of Rome. And with that he turned and went away. So she had her answer. And he knew. Not long after that, apparently, because he was highly placed in the Anglican structure, he was going to visit the Archbishop of Canterbury, who by then, of course, was the head of the whole system after the king, in Lambeth. So he was going in the corridors of Lambeth Palace, meeting the Archbishop of Canterbury, to which he had access because of his great knowledge and culture. And as he was going through the gigantic corridor, suddenly he felt a terrible pain, dropped to the ground, and he too was a ghost. His heart or something gave in, as it can do, and he didn't have time to die in the arms of Rome. So, insurance not fully paid up. This very day, the gentleman who was taking me to visit our friend Pat, who's maybe even dead by now, he was on the way out, in very good dispositions, by the way, and very lucid. He quoted his brother, the priest, Franciscan, who had a lot to do with preparing people for death, and he would say, even publicly, the Catholic Church, Catholic faith, is a very difficult faith to live, but it's a very easy one in which to die.